BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Ned Heads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Thursday. Welcome to this special bonus episode of Black Box Online Radio. If you're new to BBOR, this is a true crime channel, but I mostly talk about unsolved mysteries, such as the Zodiac Killer, Jack the Ripper, and D.B. Cooper. And if you're curious about those cases, I invite you to hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with some discussions related to them. But I wanted to use this as an opportunity to talk about Bryan Kohberger and the Idaho 4 murders. Now, out of all the true crime cases that I've explored, I think over the last 12 months, specifically the last 8, I spent more time watching content related to Bryan Kohberger and the Idaho 4 murders than the featured stories here on Black Box Online Radio. But that does not mean that I am a pure expert, because some people have just made this their life for the last 3 years following this case. And I've said that I've watched a lot of content about it. Well, that's because it was featured on a lot of the high-profile true crime shows. Court TV was all over the story, not to mention the Law and Crime Network, News Nation, and even some of the more independent programs such as Crime Talk. They did regular coverage about Bryan Kohberger, the legal proceedings, as well as the statements from the victims' families and so on. But now Bryan Kohberger has entered a guilty plea to the murders of Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Madison Mogen, and Kaylee Gonzalez from 2022, and he also pled guilty to the burglary charge. But what's next? What is going to happen? At first, this story is going to be talked about a lot less, and some people are just horribly disappointed, particularly the law tubers, as they're called now, the people who specialize on the legal aspects of true crime. It was almost as if they were cheerleading for the trial to start, because they just said, this is going to be the biggest trial of the year. We can't wait. We're going to be right outside, and we're going to give you day-to-day coverage of the Bryan Kohberger trial. Well, guess what? That is most likely and almost certainly not going to happen. He's already given the guilty plea, and he did that most likely as a way to save his own life so he wouldn't be facing the death penalty, which he most likely would have been convicted anyway. And, this is just where I'm getting to the heart of the issue and why I wanted to make this episode. We have known for months who the killer was. We have known for ages that it was Bryan Kohberger. His DNA was found at the scene of the crime. A car matching the description of the vehicle that he owned was seen on camera driving around near the scene of the crime. His cell phone was turned off at the time of the murders, turned on right after the murders. His cell phone data showed that he was driving around late at night, before and after. All of this stuff indicated that he was the killer. Not to mention the K-bar knife. He purchased one off of Amazon.com. He left the knife sheath behind at the crime scene, which had the DNA on it, so then he was looking at buying another one, or a replacement one, on Amazon. He was seen wearing a black mask when he committed the crime, and they even found out that he purchased the black mask from Dick's Sporting Goods in Pennsylvania. So all of this stuff, it's just like a giant slam dunk. It was obviously him. And that just raises the question of, why was this story talked about so widely? Why was this story talked about more than other true crime cases? Was there an enormous amount of empathy for the victims' families? Absolutely yes. I don't doubt that. But was the mainstream media concerned about that? No. And some people will not want to hear this, but I'm going to share what I genuinely think. The reason why this case was talked about more so than other true crime cases is because mainstream news outlets liked sharing photos of Kaylee Gonzalez and Madison Mogen. And there were other victims who were killed, Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin, but they were a couple, and almost always they show photos of them standing together, whereas with Kaylee and Maddie, they show the full body pics. They're very frequently wearing dresses. They're very frequently doing some type of pose for the photos, and that's why That's why the MSM enjoyed sharing those images, because they were trying to capitalize on the attractive features of those particular victims. And I don't fault any of the viewers for watching this stuff. I mean, it's on Court TV, it's on News Nation. These are the stories that were featured. I don't fault the girls at all for doing any of their actions. They didn't deserve to be murdered. The only people that you can criticize are the ones in the MSM who knew exactly what they were doing the whole time, and they created just this narrative about how it's trying to pass it off as empathy for the victims, but the people who were behind those news networks knew exactly what they were doing. The second thing that I wanted to share in this episode is more related to what is going to happen next for Bryan Kohberger. And I think immediately there's going to be a big reduction in news coverage. I mean, I can already see that a lot of the channels that would regularly talk about this as their featured story are going to be talking about Bryan Kohberger less and less, but they're just trying to hold on to this. They're talking about his prison life and his conditions. They realize that they're losing their opportunity to talk about their biggest story, so they're just holding on to it. They're talking about, well, what's he going to be feeling 5 years from now? And you can see that they're struggling to come up with content now that there's not going to be a major trial. And as far as the future of the way that people will perceive Bryan Kohberger, somebody has to question, will people be studying him in criminology classes? Because Bryan Kohberger was a criminology student. He was a PhD student at the University of Washington State, or Washington State University at Pullman, excuse me. And I don't think they will be studying Bryan Kohberger in criminology classes. I think they already are studying Bryan Kohberger in the world of criminology. And I think this really just goes to show that he made a terrible impact on America. And I think the only real benefit to all of this news coverage is that we got a window into his world. When the Idaho murders first happened in 2022, I saw the headlines, but I didn't pay close attention to them. As I said, that's not the real focus of this YouTube channel. And in 2024, I began watching a lot more true crime content on the television, some of the more famous shows from networks that I just talked about, Court TV, News Nation, and so on, of course, even True Crime News, and I'm a daily listener to Crime Talk, and they use the Bryan Kohberger case as their feature story. They regularly do episodes or segments about the Bryan Kohberger case. And I really could see that this is so much more than just somebody who made a bad decision. This is so much more than somebody who just lost it one night. Was he a good person for most of his life, and one day he just snapped? I don't think so. Instead, I think that this is so much more about how there is this type of animosity that was in him for a very long time. One thing that we experience when we're looking at serial killers is they decided at a very young age that they were going to be a killer, and they were just waiting for the opportune moment, or they were waiting for something to push them over the edge. And I do mean that. I mean that very literally. They've already made the decision that they want to kill. It's just pre-choosing the victim. Who's going to piss them off? The next person who looks at me the wrong way is going to get my wrath. Something to that effect. And it also seemed very simple and easy to understand. For example, Bryan Kohberger was a vegan, and there was a restaurant called the Mad Greek in Moscow, Idaho, that had a vegan menu. Somebody was freaking out in the comments section saying, everybody calls it a vegan restaurant. It's not a vegan restaurant. Well, it was a restaurant that had a vegan menu, and I was a vegetarian for 6 years and a vegan for 3 months. And yes, people will do something like that, drive to another town for a specialty restaurant. That is totally normal. I eat meat now, though, so I don't have to worry about those things, but I'm just sharing some personal experience. As far as the way that Kohberger would have operated, Maddie Mogan was a server at the Mad Greek restaurant, as was Zena Kernodle. But the fact that Maddie played a much larger role in this is really, really apparent, because you can see this in the way that Bryan Kohberger would have operated. And one person who compiled a lot of this information and arranged it very neatly was Howard Bloom. He is someone who is not very likable. He was someone who was definitely trying to cash in on the story, the guy that wrote the book about the case before the trial even started, and now we know that the trial is not going to start. But Howard Bloom was also the person that was really insinuating a different link that I'll talk about in a second. And with the actions of Bryan Kohberger on the night of the murders, it really appears that Maddie Mogen was the specific target. Most likely, something happened at the Mad Greek restaurant. Maybe she looked at him the wrong way. Maybe she was just being very polite. But what Howard Bloom was saying is he wouldn't even need any type of specific interaction with her. Maybe they didn't exchange words. Maybe she wasn't his server. Maybe he just liked her physical appearance. He saw her name tag and decided that he was going to use her as his victim. Again, he had decided that he wanted to become a serial killer. He was going to use his criminology education to become a serial killer in the tradition and pathway of Ted Bundy. And this is something that was very, very thought out, although there were an enormous amount of flaws. So Bryan Kohberger drove to the Kings Road house. He turned off his phone for the time of the murders, and it became very clear that he had a specific target because, again, he entered the second floor kitchen door that had the sliding door on the kitchen door, because the first floor was where they had the parking area. The second floor was where someone could enter and then easily walk to the third floor. And Maddie's room was marked with a pink M that was in the window, so he went specifically for Maddie Mogen's bedroom. But what he didn't account on was that Kaylee Gonzalez was in bed with her. I don't think that there was any particular evidence to suggest that he could have known ahead of time that Kaylee Gonzalez would have been sleeping in the same bed. I think he definitely would have known about her from social media. Again, she had lots of photos posted with Maddie. It seemed like that he had at least one woman in his life in the past that he was infatuated with that had a resemblance to Kaylee Gonzalez. I think that she could have easily have been one of his targets, but all of the signs are pointing to him targeting Maddie, where he goes into the house. He goes up the stairs to the third floor, goes to Maddie's room specifically, stabs Maddie first because she's in bed and she doesn't have the most offensive wounds. She was the initial target. This wakes Kaylee Gonzalez up, and then he starts stabbing her, and she puts up a bigger fight because she's awakened. And then this is where the knife sheath comes off. I talked about this on a previous episode. I've only done one other episode about this case. This is the second, not counting a short or something, but really just these two episodes. And I talked about how it really isn't abnormal to me that he would have removed the sheath and dropped it, because one story that I looked at in the past was the murder of Bobby Kent, and his case was turned into a movie called Bully. It's also based on the book Bully, the Ultimate High School Revenge. And that's exactly what the killer does. He has a knife, takes off the knife sheath, just throws it down. All right, we're in battle mode now. So that type of thought process could exist. And what one of you guys in the comment section said, it could have also come off in the struggle with Kaylee Gonzalez. That's why it was under Maddie Mogen's body, or next to it rather. So both of those are plausible. They have this altercation that takes place, and Bryan Kohberger is just stabbing her very, very ferociously. At this point, the adrenaline kicks in. So when he is going out to exit, there's not a door on the third floor that would have exited out of the house back to the ground, so he goes down to the second floor, and that's when he encounters Xana Kernodle and ultimately Ethan Chapin. And I really think that 3 victims were just there at the wrong place at the wrong time, but after murdering 4 people, he was just exhausted, and he also was just coming down from this exhilaration that he had experienced. And then he decided to exit. He most likely took the shower curtain out of his bathroom at some point and either put it in the trunk or on the front seat of the car, and he was using it as some type of protective cover so he wouldn't get blood everywhere. And he drove to some part of southern Idaho and destroyed a lot of the evidence. And you really could see this from his criminological education. He was talking about things in his writings about wearing fiberless overalls and so on, about how that can be used to stop these crimes, or that can be used as a way that will not leave fibers behind at a crime scene, to be very clear. So then, that's how Bryan Kohberger was ultimately operating. It seemed like he had a specific target, but he wanted to be a serial killer. He wanted to turn himself into one of the most famous serial killers in the country, somebody who would have been on par with Ted Bundy and BTK. Now, Howard Bloom was also the person who was insinuating that Bryan Kohberger did this specifically to get the attention of Dr. Catherine Ramsland, and I am not necessarily convinced of that. Catherine Ramsland was Bryan Kohberger's professor at DeSales University. She also co-wrote a book with BTK Dennis Rader, and she has written 59 books, and you can just kind of do the math about how long that would take in her teaching career as well as her investigative and research career. But was he doing this specifically to get her attention so she would think about him and start just kind of getting the approval of somebody who had taught him in the past? I think most likely not. If that were the case, that would definitely be a secondary motive or a third motive or a fourth motive, because it would be something that would be very low ranking on the totem pole. I think that Bryan Kohberger was somebody who felt denied access to intimacy, or just he wanted power over his chosen, preferred, intimate partners that he was unable to have. He was attracted to Maddie Mogen's appearance. End of discussion. That was it. That was the primary reason. I mean, maybe there was something that set him off, like the way that she looked at him or the way that she was acting toward him. But we don't necessarily know that until he confesses. But what's more important to think about is he pre-chose her because of her physical appearance. Again, that is no fault of Maddie at all. And then ultimately, that's what Bryan Kohberger chose to do. He was deranged. And Scott Reich says this all the time on Crime Talk. Some people just aren't wired properly. And that's how serial killers operate. That is not an arbitrary statement. That is not just an off-the-cuff statement. If you look at a book like The Psychopath Inside by Dr. James H. Fallon, I reference it all the time on Black Box Online Radio, he stated that there are three major reasons why someone would go on to become a serial killer. The first one is that there is genetics, something in the genes. The second is neurological functioning. You're talking about being wired properly. There's an irregularity between the amygdala that processes emotion, and the orbitofrontal cortex, which is behind the eyes in the brain. Like right behind your eyes is your orbitofrontal cortex, and that is all about acting on desires and urges. Somebody once said, the part of the brain that's right behind the eyes is all about food and sex. So somebody is acting on urges and desires, and they don't feel emotions for other people because of this irregularity in their brain, in their neurological functioning. And on average, a psychopathic serial killer is going to have an amygdala that is 17% smaller than that of a normal functioning person. I've covered this stuff all on older episodes of Black Box Online Radio. So ultimately, acting on desires, not feeling anything for the victims. If anything, they feel stimulated, they feel exhilarated when they are committing these murders. And looking at the actions and activities of Bryan Kohberger, it seems very clear that that's what happened. He came home, he took the shower, put on his dress shirt, posed for a disgusting selfie. He looks absolutely hideous in the shower selfie photo. Then he's listening to music like Criminal by Britney Spears and slowing down the speed so her voice sounds like a man. He's watching videos about Ted Bundy online. He was celebrating this. He wanted to become a serial killer, and he was using his criminological education as a method to do so. And that's sickening. I mean, people are supposed to study criminology to prevent crimes. And criminology is a real discipline that I respect. It's about the relationships between human behavior and the law. It's the study of crime. And there are people who go into that profession with honest and good intentions, and there are people like Bryan Kohberger who are just abusing the system for their own selfishness. But then, how are people going to respond to this story years from now? Already, there is a movement. And I'm going to say this name once, and only once. These people are called the Pro-Burgers. I don't like that name, and I don't ever want to say it again here on Black Box Online Radio, but there are the people who are insisting that he is innocent. And it doesn't surprise me at all, because with O.J. Simpson, we had the O.J. Truther movement, and even with Richard Speck, who committed the South Chicago Massacre, which was a mass murder that was committed by knife in 1966, I have multiple books by people who claim that Richard Speck was innocent. With Bryan Kohberger, I think it's really obvious that he was guilty, and they're going to be looking at all types of alternative theories, and this comes back to something that I've also dealt with a lot on Black Box Online Radio. In 2018 and 2019, and even a little bit into 2020, one subject that I was heavily involved with was the psychology of conspiracy theorists. Not conspiracy theories, but conspiracy theorists. Like, how do these people think who are just very passionate about conspiracy theories? And the ultimate conclusion is some people just have trouble accepting that bad things happen. Some people have trouble accepting that there is a very simple narrative, and they just have to look for a different angle. And also, people are still making content about the O.J. Simpson case. That trial was so highly publicized that people just experience a type of emotional lift when they're watching content related to the O.J. Simpson trial, so they don't want it to stop. So they start looking at alternative theories, and some of that will happen with the Bryan Kohberger case, although not to the same extent. That is something that is going to be very, very important to watch as time goes by. And then the next issue that we're going to experience with the Bryan Kohberger aftermath is they will start explaining their alternative theories. I was just watching an episode of Surviving the Survivor where they were talking about Bryan Kohberger's actions, and somebody wrote into the show asking, the panel of experts about, does the evidence not suggest that there were two perpetrators? What if there were two people that both had K-bar knives and that they went into the house, one person goes to the third floor and one person goes to the second floor? Because if this person were indeed stalking the house, they should have known that there could be as many as six people at a minimum. I mean, at six people at a minimum in the house, wouldn't that be a very big risk for somebody just to go in with one knife? I mean, couldn't there be an enormous amount of complications with that? What about two killers? And I'm just giving my own response. I don't think that there's anything weird about that. I don't think any of the evidence suggests that there were two killers. Why would one person do that when there could be six people in the house? Because it was so late at night. He figured that everybody would either be in bed asleep or in their bedrooms. Go in, go out. And again, Maddie Mogan was the specific target. So as far as two killers, I'm just not seeing it. And he thought that people would be in their bedrooms, yes, but what he didn't account for is somebody might be ordering DoorDash at 4:30 in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, whenever it was, and that, of course, was St. Carnodal, and ultimately, one murder turned into four murders, as horrible and as terrible as it sounds. So then the next issue is, why that specific night? Why did Kohberger go after Maddie Mogan and her friends on that night? And somebody just wrote this out in the comments section, and I think it's a very solid point. If he just had a plan to murder Maddie Mogan, he didn't have to enter her house. I mean, he could have waited until she was walking by herself and abducted her and forced her into his white Hyundai Elantra. But what he chose to do was, he chose to break into the home. And the reason why is because Maddie Mogan had previously been at a food truck place, the Grub Truck area, where multiple people were out. It appears that Kaylee Gonzalez and Maddie Mogan had been at a bar. This Grub Truck had a live stream that was aired, and if this guy were stalking her on social media, he could have watched the live stream and then seen that she was very, very drunk. She could barely walk straight, and then just going back to the home, she would have been rather defenseless. He may have known that Kaylee Gonzalez was also in the house, and he had taken a liking to her appearance. I talked about that a lot from one time. Maddie was the primary target, Kaylee was the secondary target. I don't think he hesitated for a second to kill Kaylee Gonzalez. I just think that he was focused more on Maddie Mogen. I shouldn't even call her a secondary target at this point, because maybe there's insufficient information, and the reason I say that is I just don't think he could have known with certainty that she would be in Maddie's bedroom at all at the time of the murder. He may have known that she would have been in the house and also drunk, but insufficient evidence to say that she was truly a secondary target, but I do have my suspicions. But that was just it. She was in a very vulnerable place. He sees that around a couple hours before the murder and thinks, all right, tonight's the night. And then he goes after them. But some people have even talked about this guy Kohberger supposed to be smart, yet he didn't leave his cell phone back in the apartment. If he had done something like leave his cell phone charging at the place where he lived, couldn't he have just said that he was asleep at the time? And when they have this white Hyundai Elantra going by, just be like, that's not my car, something like that. The fact that he brought his cell phone with him, turned it off before the murders, turned it on after the murders, that really is not the best strategy. Not giving anyone any ideas, but I totally get the thought process. Anyway, I shared one alternative theory about the two killers. Another one is, and this has been going on for years, I suppose, for at least the last 12 months, when I was following the case, almost everybody has been saying that this was a drug-related crime. Not everyone. The majority of the people who propose an alternative theory say that it was drug-related. Let me be clear about that. Not everyone says this, but the majority of the people who propose alternative theories and alternative suspects say that this was a drug-related crime. Somebody just wrote into my channel last week saying that, okay, what you gotta understand is, those food trucks were an open-air drug market. Maddie and Kaylee were most likely drug informants, and then Bryan Kohberger just took the fall for this. If you have proof of that, I will examine the evidence and I will look at your statement of proof. Until then, I would not be going just based on conjecture, speculation, and connecting the dots alone. In fact, if we're going to talk about this grub truck live stream in the open air food trucks that they had in Moscow, Idaho, I think that is very telling. Now, some people have talked about a different type of alternative theory, and again, I'm just going to lay this out. This is something that's been discussed online. I don't endorse it. It's not mine. You heard everything that I said. I think there was one killer, Bryan Kohberger, who acted alone because he was attracted to Maddie Mogen. But some people have been saying that Maddie Mogen was a bully, and she bullied a girl named Hannah Clear, also known as Hannah Cleary, pronounced, but I've seen both pronunciations in videos, and she was someone who ultimately ended up committing suicide, and some people thought that Maddie Mogen was murdered in retaliation for Hannah Cleary's death. But firstly, Hannah Cleary's father denies that his daughter was even committed suicide because of bullying, but moreover, it's showing that Maddie Mogen may have had a reputation for being confrontational, abrasive, and doing certain things like talking back to people, as evidenced by the Grub Truck live stream, where somebody even says something to her and apparently she's saying the F word back to him, she's talking back to him. And when I first saw this live stream, I thought, oh wow, they must have been there with an enormous amount of friends, because they're just like walking so casually into people. Maddie's even bumping into people as she's walking by them, and she's not saying anything, but it really appears that it was only her and Kaylee there, and that she was not necessarily paying attention where she was walking, and it seems like some things that she was doing were a little bit rough and abrasive. Absolutely no means for somebody to be murdered, no means for somebody to even be attacked in any way. Okay, somebody is being rough and abrasive, tell them to stop or something like that. And that's all the punishment that you would ever want to exert. The fact that someone could actually be killed for something like that, it is something that's been raised a lot. Did she do something to Bryan Kohberger at the Mad Greek restaurant that would have set him off? We aren't 100% sure. But ultimately, I think over the next decades, I do mean that 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, a lot of people are going to be pushing these types of alternative theories and trying to really focus on the drug angle. They're going to be saying that, oh, yeah, well, all of the victims' families were associated with drugs, and I'm going to say I don't really want to hear that. They're going to say that Kelly Gonzalez's uncle was in jail for murder, Nathan Gonzalez, and I'm going to say, I'm not necessarily sure that's connected. But some people just have this insistent urge that it's more than just somebody felt rejected by society, so he murdered a woman that he found attractive. And that really is it. And they were also talking about that on Surviving the Survivor, and I'm even going to mention some of this on Zodiac Monday about how if somebody commits a crime by knife, then that type of person is most likely going to be someone who is not exactly giving off very warm vibes. There's this idea that the serial killer is the nicest person in the world. Well, if somebody's going to be stabbing people by knife, that's more likely going to be the type of person who is going to be making people uncomfortable when they're around him, someone whom they aren't going to try to mess with because they think that he is actually capable of something destructive, but at the same time, he's mostly going to be keeping to himself. He's most likely going to be someone who is going to have awkward conversations with people. He might talk in a friendly way, but then he'll shift the conversation to something violent, even if it's an obsession about hunting, or maybe about knives and guns. He is going to try and appear normal, but he's going to make people feel very uncomfortable, and they will perceive him as a type of oddball personality. And I definitely think that that could apply to so many other true crime cases. But these are my concluding thoughts on the Idaho 4 murders, and I've talked about some other stories involved with this, such as the story of Hannah Cleary, as well as the victims and their families. And one more time, though, this will probably be the last episode that I ever make on the Idaho 4 murders. I've only made 2. This is the second one. But I think that we need to let the story rest, and other people will have to explore some different aspects of the true crime world. And one last rest in peace to Maddie Mogan, Kaylee Gonzalez, Ethan Chapin, and Zaina Kernodle. Okay, and you guys know where to write the show, and I'll say until next time.